All right. If you are watching this lecture before you've watched the videos on the century, you should pause this and go back and watch those videos first. They give context to what we're going to talk about here. And this lecture is all about bringing the readings and the videos together to understand what happened in our country that changed things from the way it was set up and the way it was operating under the Constitution, if you will, or I shouldn't say at the time of the writing of the Constitution, the founding of the country, until what we have today, okay? Because there was effectively one major shift, and this talks about that shift, right? So to put context to it in theoretical terms, we talk about the centralization of political control, meaning how concentrated is government authority in one unit, one entity, or dispersed abroad a bunch of them, all right? In our system at the time of the founding, it was a very confederated system. If you remember, the Articles of Confederation was our first constitution. So trivia question for you, how many constitutions have we had at the national level? We've had 2, and we're on our second. The first one was the Articles of Confederation, and in it, the states were sovereign, the nation was subject to the states. And so the power was very dispersed amongst the various states. You had independent states, effectively. And then they came together for the sake of some unified activities. Well, after that, after the war was ended and they got back together, they realized that there were too many problems with that, collective dilemmas, as we've been talking about. And so they reorganized in more of a federated state, where the central authority had, the central government, our national government, Washington, D.C., had more authority and was the sovereign entity over the states. Okay? So now the states were subject to the national government. And that's where we've been after that. But we're not at the system of, at the state of, in the condition of a unitary system, like you have in certain other countries, where literally the national government runs all of government. We still have state governments, we still have local and municipal level governments under those states, whereas in many other countries, all you have effectively is the national government. So those are very centralized, we call them unitary systems, versus ours was a federation, versus what we used to be a confederation. And so to point out that nature, that federated nature of our government, I use this diagram. So you see that we have the federal government here at this level, the state government here, and then our local governments. Notice the number. We have one national government, one federal government, okay? Whereas we have 50 states currently, and we have tens of thousands of local governments, municipalities, counties, school boards, special use authorities like port authorities, mud utility districts, things like that, municipal utility districts. We got all those, okay? I just put the most common 2 here, county level and then municipal level, city level, all right? And within all these governments, we have those 3 different functions of government. We have the legislative function, the making of laws, we have the executive function, the carrying out of laws, and then you have the judicial function, which is the resolving disputes, okay? So we have a federal system. We have government broken up into multiple different levels and in multiple different institutions, all right? It's a federal system. Now, after the second Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, what we call the U.S. Constitution, the way that those governments operated in relationship to each other is that the state government dominated. Remember, we're coming off of a system where the state governments were sovereign, not just dominating, they were sovereign. Here, currently, or at least under the initial system, the state governments were still dominant in the sense that they had the largest jurisdiction. More of the activity that government covered was handled at the state level than even at the local level, and especially than at the federal level. Federal level was very limited. Congress made some national laws that affected interstate commerce, foreign affairs, things like that. The Supreme Court was active in resolving a lot of disputes, especially as interstate commerce was growing. Those debates and issues were often taken to the courts to decide, at least when it was just 2 parties battling against each other. Parties not meaning political parties, parties meaning the 2 sides of a court case. And then you have the president, who effectively was the chief clerk. Literally had no real leadership role, was just an administrator of moving things along. Because there wasn't much to the actual activity of federal government. All right? And that's the system that operated. But it shifted to this system, what we call cooperative federalism. I'm sorry. The first system was called dual federalism, operated until this time that we're going to talk about. And then after that, we shifted towards cooperative federalism, and one could say we're still tinkering at the margins, but this is largely what happened. And you see a massive change. First, the breadth of jurisdiction moved from the state level of government to the national level of government. I'm sorry, I went the wrong direction. To the national level of government. And you see that the role of the president and the federal bureaucracy grew massively in relationship to everything else. So the federal government, as a level of government, took over, literally preempted is the term we use, part of the jurisdiction of the states, meaning policy areas that had previously been governed at the state were now being governed at the national level. And things that had previously been dealt with by Congress or by the court was now being dealt with by the president and the bureaucracy. All right? So how did we make this massive change? What led to it? When political scientists look at major changes in a political system, we tend to look for three causes. Major crisis, major conflict, literally people fighting, conflict, not just, a struggling time. And then complexity. Things they grew out of hand, which is literally what happened between the first Constitution and the second Constitution. Things grew out of hand. There were things they couldn't handle in the first Constitution that made them go back and rethink matters, and it led to a second Constitution. So what happened in this time, in the 1920s, 1930s? Well, first let's set it up. What was life like beforehand? We talked about the structure of government. Now what was life like? Socially, these characters are very important, and you saw these in the video a bit. You had a lot of philanthropy by association, meaning the way that people got certain things done, things that we often take for granted now, like even fire service, if you will, when your house is on fire or property is on fire, how do you get that taken care of? In the 1920s, that was often taken care of by your philanthropic association, meaning your civic club, or your church club, or your benevolence group. So whatever membership club you belong to often took care of things like this. There's literally a story of a couple of associations in New York arriving at the scene of a fire and fighting amongst each other about who has the jurisdiction to put out the fire, and ended up losing the entire building. But that's how these basic services were often handled. They were handled by philanthropic association. What's the problem with that? Well, what if you're not a member of these clubs? Exactly. People can fall through the cracks. You also saw an expansion of interstate commerce. There was a lot more activity crossing state lines. And so if you're crossing state lines, one state doesn't govern. You may have some differences between the two. How do you reconcile those? You had much more of that type of activity going on. You also had an innocence regarding the economic system. People didn't really know how the larger, broader economy worked, especially in terms of the stock market, which is going to become very important. And you also had a very patriarchal social pattern in the sense that father knew best, and people believed that. And if a man stood up and said, "I will take care of it," people believed it and took him at that word. Again, politically, in terms of how things looked, yes, we talked about the structure, but just in terms of how people perceived of government in their lives. Mainly people saw the states, as we mentioned. They saw their state government. They also saw the parties, the political parties, especially in terms of political machines, where the parties virtually controlled government and doled out the services of government based on your adherence and usefulness to the party. So if you did what the party said, you got the benefits of government. And if you didn't, you're left out. Then you also had the federal judiciary, as we talked about it. They were the everyday arbiters of the economy, meaning they helped decide those economic disputes. Again, early on as these interstate commerce was progressing. So you did see a little bit of expansion, and the textbook talks about this, a little bit of expansion during the 1890s. We saw a major downturn during the recession even, depending on what term you use, downturn, recession, depression, all those just differ in terms of severity. But in essence, some bad times hit in the 1890s. And in response to that, the federal government did take up a little more activity. You saw the federal government step in to regulate food, medicine, and clothing. to break up the monopolies, the antitrust era. The trusts were these major conglomerates of economic companies, these businesses, and the federal government basically outlawed that. Say, y'all have to break up, you have to start competing with each other instead of one person making all the decisions. It was the first time that we adopted an income tax. Okay, but notice the income tax in that day and age was very limited. All right, it was first had the purpose of retiring war debt. We had just come off the Civil War. We had also come off war internationally, Spain and some of the other nations, and so we needed to pay off that war debt. And so they enacted an income tax, a pretty steep income tax, but only for 3 years and only against the top. I think it was 1% of income earners, so the very, very wealthy. And so it was not a universal income tax, and it was temporary, and it was only for that purpose of retiring war debt, not just to bring money into the federal government. But they had to pass the amendment in order to do that, because the Constitution had language that was interpreted as forbidding the federal government from taxing incomes of all the nation, if you will. So they passed the 16th Amendment to change it. And then they made the Senate more responsive to the people by having them be elected directly. Prior to that time, senators were elected by the state legislature. So it was indirect. And then you entered the New Deal era. And the New Deal, we're going to get to this in a moment. Actually, do I have that? Yeah, forgive me. Yeah, I should have that in there. Forgive me, there's a slide missing. But nevertheless, the New Deal era hit. And why did the New Deal era hit? It hit in response to, sorry. Yeah, I don't have that slide. Forgive me. In response to the Great Depression and the Great Dust Bowl drought. Actually, I shouldn't say that. The Great Depression, which had its two roots in the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Dust Bowl drought of the 1933s all the way up to the 1940s. And the videos talk about that, how literally in the stock market crash in 1929, 30% of all the wealth in the country evaporated within a month, in October to November of that year. Gone. So literally 30 cents out of every dime, gone. And unfortunately, much of that was born, well, it was born all throughout society. You could say the wealthy, you could say the poor, but really it was born all throughout society. And that was the reason why it was so widespread and so devastating. But then the Great Dust Bowl, right on the heels of that. So that happened in 1929. By 1933, you have the Great Dust Bowl where literally crops won't grow in the Midwest. Ground has been so overfarmed and is so dry that literally the winds coming off the Rocky Mountains would pick up the dirt and carry it all the way past the Mississippi. And literally that drought, those conditions didn't improve for 7 years. So much so, I mean, you saw it in the video where some people were saying that they thought the judgment of God had fallen down on the land. It was a bad time. It was a bad time. And in response to this bad time, the New Deal. So the Great Depression created many problems in society that, and this was the argument of those who favored the New Deal, that arguably the federal government could solve. FDR, who put this forward, and actually let's go ahead and go there. FDR, who was responsible for all this, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt, literally argued that the federal government is the best actor for solving the nation's toughest problems. And that view is still held today by those who favor the New Deal and favor those types of interventions, that the federal government is the best actor to solve the nation's toughest problems. And so what happened in the New Deal? You had a massive expansion of the federal government involvement in society. Really economically, the one tack, if you will, of the New Deal was just to put money in people's hands. Money that had stopped circulating in the economy, and we'll talk about that more in the second half of the course when we talk about the economy. So money that had stopped circulating in the economy and therefore stopped arriving to people's pockets, federal government would just put money in people's pockets. So many of these programs were literally jobs programs, putting money in people's pockets, or even benevolence programs, Social Security, in the sense of putting cash literally in the pockets of retirees, or mothers single mothers, that's what I was looking for, the term I was looking for. Single mothers. Also in guaranteeing the money that people had. So the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created during this time to literally guarantee people's bank accounts. So people didn't, quote unquote, make a run on the banks, which is they try to get all their money, everyone trying to get all their money out of the banks at one time because they didn't trust that the bank would be able to produce their money or safeguard their money. So the government said, we'll step in and we'll safeguard it. So whatever money you put in the bank, we guarantee it. And therefore people were like, okay, I'll stop trying to pull my money out of the bank then. But you have a bunch of these different activities. And to fund these activities, because these were literally putting money in people's pockets, you had a massive expansion of the federal income tax. So it was the first time that the income tax was extended to all wages effectively, even though many people were excluded, over half were excluded, as is the case today, based on income limits. But effectively everyone is covered, and it became permanent. It's never gone anywhere since. So before it was limited. It was for a specific purpose. It was limited to certain income classes. Now it covers everyone and it's permanent. So this New Deal. And as you notice up here, this line, you're like, you skipped that top line. This is important because FDR generally had to do this on his own over the objections of the other parts of government. Meaning, instead of negotiating with Congress on most of this, he basically bypassed or leapfrogged Congress to make these happen on his own. Over 3,700 executive orders. The next nearest president, forgive me if I have my stats wrong, about 600. And that was FDR's successor, Herbert Hoover. No, Truman, sorry. Hoover was before. Truman came after. Then, and he, as if that wasn't enough, doing it by himself, when Congress would disagree or try to rebuff him, he would veto them. Over 635 vetoes, I believe. The next nearest is, again, Truman, FDR's successor, with 970. And actually, I'm sorry, executive orders, the next nearest was Woodrow Wilson at 1,800. So more than twice the number that Woodrow Wilson put forward. And this New Deal was so popular that it was largely followed by the presidents that succeeded him. Truman followed with his Fair Deal, which raised the minimum wage, provided for public housing, extended Social Security, at least to those who were elderly. JFK followed with his New Frontier. LBJ followed with his Great Society. And you might notice something. These are all Democrat presidents, or at least members of the Democratic Party. There was a Republican in the midst of that, Eisenhower. And he even had the Interstate Highway Act, where basically he built all of the, or at least the backbones of all of the interstate highways in our country. And so he had a jobs program, if you will, a stimulus program, if you will, though not typically on the nature of what these Democratic Party presidents did. And so what did this do to the executive branch? It created what we now call the bureaucracy, which in 2006 numbered over 2.6 million employees. So yeah, I need a more current figure for that, but nevertheless, over 2.6 million civil employees, literally about 1 in every 100 adult workers works for the executive branch of the federal government. Now that's still small in terms of government. There are more workers at the state level, more workers at the local levels, but just get in your mind the size, if you will, of the federal government in the sense of the executive branch of the federal government, the size of this bureaucracy. 1 out of every 100 workers works for a federal agency in some way, shape, or form. A national level executive branch agency. And they have these different forms. You'll read about those in your text. What did Congress do in response to all this? How did Congress react to all this? Well, at first, and you saw with the vetoes and the executive orders, they were contrary to this, but especially after the election returns started coming in and everyone was recognizing that people really like this, Congress started going, me too. We're with him. And so they delegated to the executive branch all this activity. And especially all the authority in these activities. What do I mean by that? So Congress makes the laws. Congress has to decide what can government do, what will government do. And so it's their responsibility to spell out exactly the activity that even the executive branch would do. But what Congress started doing is delegating much of that decision making. They would make, if you will, the skeleton of the laws, and then they would expect the executive branch, the bureaucracy, the experts that would be hired in these different areas to fill in the gaps. So for example, clean water. Congress would make a bill, pass a bill that says we want water to be clean and safe. Then they would say, okay, Environmental Protection Agency, it is your job to define exactly how many particles of bromine is safe. And so they would leave that to them to fill in the gaps. All right? So when bureaucrats make these decisions, we call these administrative rules. All right? But the key point is that rulemaking is effectively legislating because they are making these unelected bureaucratic agents, and that's not, I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative way, just the term that we use for those who work in the executive branch of government. These agents are making decisions that govern our lives. This is effectively law. Rules are law. But the Constitution would have that those laws be made in Congress, not in the executive branch. Made by people who we can directly elect, not by people who we don't elect at all. So that's something to keep in mind. However, Congress did retain to themselves what is called oversight, which is to say they will continue to supervise and look over those executive branch agencies to make sure that they are doing things that is consistent with what Congress wants. Okay? So they did retain that. But nevertheless, Congress effectively shifted all these responsibilities over to the executive branch. How did the courts react? So we got the legislative branch delegating to the executive branch. How did the courts, who were typically making those decisions in those economic areas, how did they react to what the executive branch was doing? Well, most early cases, if you will, early in the sense of right around the time of the Constitution, or just after the founding, if you will, in the early 1800s, did favor the national government in the sense that Congress, or the courts believed that the Constitution allowed for the national government to take a central role, especially in things of interstate commerce and matters like that. So you see those issues. And that the states are not sovereign over the national government. So the courts did favor that. But then, when FDR gets around here, so about 100 years later, they interpret his actions as unconstitutional because they started regulating intrastate commerce, not interstate commerce. Meaning they started regulating activity and laws that typically govern what happened within a state, instead of governing or affecting laws that affect activity that crosses state lines. At least that's what the opinion of the court. At least until the switch in time that saved none. And you may have heard that phrase before. That is a phrase to capture what happened basically in the court in response to what FDR was doing. So let me explain it. So FDR presents, and forgive me, I'm blanking on the year right now that he did this, but FDR puts forth a plan to change the size of the Supreme Court. Now you say, how can the president change the size of the Supreme Court? Well, note that the size of the Supreme Court is not actually written in the U.S. Constitution. That's the size of the Supreme Court, as well as the entire federal judiciary, is determined by Congress. And Congress had fixed it at 9 as of just past the Civil War, 1869. And so the nation has been accustomed to there being 9, but there was nothing in the Constitution, at least, that said it had to be 9. And Congress could change that at any time if they wanted. Well, FDR put forth a plan saying he wanted to add a justice to the court for every justice that was over 70. At this time, there, I believe, were 5 justices over 70. And so that would have changed the number. 5? I'm going to say 4 that were over 70. Forgive me, I'm forgetting all these details. Sad. But nevertheless, 4 over 70. And so that would have changed the number from 9 to 13. Well, who appoints the justices to the Supreme Court, or at least who nominates them? Exactly, the president. The president nominates to the court. So if he was to nominate 4 new justices, who do you think those new justices would favor in terms of him versus the current majority on the court. Exactly, they would favor him. He's appointing them. He's going to pick people who favor his view. And so he would then change the balance, instead of being 5-4 against him, to being 5-8 in favor of him. 8 of them being in favor of him. And so that was the plan he put forth. Now, historians argue that the Congress would not have gone along with those plans, the president doesn't have the authority to change that. Congress would have had to change that. But nevertheless, before Congress took this up, you had this, where one of those justices, one of the 5 that were against him, switched to start voting in favor of these changes. And thus, if you will, FDR even beat back the courts. And a larger shift occurred, and we'll get to this more later in the course. The courts moved away from economic decision-making, so they stepped out of being arbiters in the economic matters and moved into the area of civil rights and civil liberties, leaving economic matters to the executive branch of the federal government. All right? How did the states react? Well, remember, the national government is sovereign. That's the key feature of our second constitution compared to the first constitution. And so the states didn't really have a whole lot to say about it, in the sense that when the national level government takes up a matter that used to be states, that used to belong to the states, it just kind of happens. And so we call that preemption. And so the states really just got kind of crowded out. Now, there's entirely the possibility of states fighting back, and we've seen more of that in these recent days, but not necessarily in those days. And even where the states fought back, the courts were now siding with FDR, and so the states lost. But what the federal government was doing, especially in these putting money in people's pockets projects, they were collecting money, if you will, at the national government through the income tax, and then sending that money back down to the states through the form of grants. And so we use the term cooperative federalism, or in this idea of cooperative federalism. Yes, the federal government is doing more, but they're doing it now through the subsidization of state and local government activity. Okay, so now the federal government is taking in the money in terms of income tax, but then sending it back to the states, trying to convince the states with that money, or by giving them that money, to do certain things that the national government wants done. So Medicaid, Medicare, housing, even some of the school programs like school lunches, all of these are federal government programs where the money comes in from the income tax and then gets shipped back down to state and local governments to convince them, persuade them to do these things that the federal government wants done. All right? So that's the more benevolent side, if you will. That's the carrot dangling in front of the state governments to get them to do what they want. But there's also this aspect of it, and that's more of a regulated federalism. This is not a term you need to remember per se, but it's just capturing the fact that many times now you have the federal government mandating that the states and local governments do things without even giving them funds, or maybe based on the threat of withholding funds. All right? And so I use the example of Harris County highway speed limits. One of the reasons why the speed limits in Harris County, if you're, let's say, driving from Montgomery or Conroe area, I think it's, yeah, I'm pretty sure they are exempt from this, but I'm not exactly, those outlying counties. Speed limit is 70 miles an hour, sometimes even 75. But then you get into Harris County and it drops to 65. And then in some areas to 60. You're like, why? You know, you could say it's congestion, yeah, but the highways are wider. So, you know, that's how you handle congestion. The reason why, just to tell the story, is because the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, wanted Houston and the Harris County area to clean up its air. And they thought a key way for them to do this would be to have the cars drive slower. Apparently cars emit less pollution when they drive slower. But of course, Harris County and the drivers of Houston did not want to do this. Who wants to slow down on the highway? Exactly. So the EPA got with the Highway Transit Authority, Federal Highway Transit Authority, and basically made this offer, if you will, to Harris County. Slow down your speed limits or lose highway funds. Harris County slowed down the speed limits. And so again, just an example of how federal government is now requiring states and localities to do certain things without funding, or at least using the threat of funding. And so there is some pushback to this. You have this term called unfunded mandates that is popular among states to argue against this preemption, this reach of the federal government into the state's activity. All right? I'm going to skip that slide, finish off with this. And so another aspect of this relationship now is, what does it mean to win as a state or lose as a state in terms of this redistribution? Just something that states definitely keep track of, but it's the notion of how much money is taken up from a state's residents into the national government that then comes back to the states. Meaning, are we getting our fair share back compared to what is sent up? And you'll see that the answer differs depending on your state. So just to show Texas, Texas here sends much more money. This is the negative side of the scale. This is the positive side. Sends more money to the state government than it receives back from the state government. Indiana, by comparison, gets more from the state government than it sends to the state government, about 50% more than what it sends. And so it differs. And this is something that states definitely keep their eye on as they're negotiating this new government situation, relationship. All right? So that's the lecture. Hope it helps put some context to everything that you just learned through those videos and read in your chapters.